Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. So much coming up this hour, including that moon launch landing delay, my restoration and renewal of Parliament interview with Lord Norton, the Scotland bin crisis, the UN nuclear power plant inspection, and Liz Truss's comments on the French President Emmanuel Macron. So much to come, but first, it's your news update.
Good afternoon, it's 3 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of its engines. Well, the unmanned rocket is the world's most powerful to date. It was due to propel a test capsule called Orion far from Earth into the moon's orbit. Engineers say an engine bleed that couldn't be remedied is the cause of the launch being called off today. They added that the first opportunity for the next launch attempt will be this Friday, but that depends on how the engine bleed develops. The Artemis 1 mission is aiming to prove that people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson emphasised the need for safety checks.
It's just illustrative that this is a very complicated machine, a very complicated system, and all those things have to work. And you don't want to light the candle until it's ready to go.
In the final week of campaigning in the Conservative leadership contest, Liz Truss's team says she favours targeted support to ease the cost of living crisis. However, the Tory leadership candidate says she's not ruling anything out. Ms Truss also says it wouldn't be right to announce her entire plan before she's seen the full Whitehall analysis. Global Chief Executive of the market research company Ipsos, Ben Page, says the Foreign Secretary is under pressure.
Public now wants to see more action and more spending. She's slightly against the grain of the things that she says she stands for, but she's probably going to be forced to do it when she turns her attention from the small number of people who are, of course, choosing the leader of the Conservative Party to the electorate as a whole.
Environment Minister and Team Rishi supporter Victoria Prentice told us the former Chancellor believes help should go to those who need it the most.
Rishi's plan is very much to target that help at the most vulnerable households. So, for example, pensioner households or people with disabilities or households on the lowest incomes. And I think that's the right way to go. I know this is hard for everybody, but for some people it's really hard and we need to help them get through it.
Residents living near Europe's biggest nuclear facility that's based in Ukraine are being given iodine tablets amid fears of a nuclear incident. Authorities handed out the medication to parents and children living close to the Zaporizhzhia power station amid intense fighting. Well, a team now from the International Atomic Energy Agency is on its way to investigate a Russian-occupied facility, saying its safety and security must be protected. The Prince of Wales will make a donation to aid charity Islamic Relief to help those affected by the floods in Pakistan. It follows a message from the Queen to the President of the country saying she's deeply saddened by the tragic loss of life and destruction. Well, Pakistan's appealing for international support as more than 1,000 people have been killed. Unusually heavy monsoon rains have caused floods in both the north and the south of the country, destroying farmland, crops and impacting more than 30 million people. The country's foreign ministers requesting financial help and aid from United Nations member states.
They're absolutely devastating. I haven't seen any destruction or devastation of this scale. I find it very difficult to put into words. The phraseologies that we're used to, whether it's monsoon rains or flooding, doesn't quite seem to encapsulate the ongoing devastation and disaster that we're still witnessing.
Britain's biggest warship has suffered a mechanical issue shortly after leaving the south coast. HMS Prince of Wales left Portsmouth on Saturday to spend the next 3 months working with US military partners in the Atlantic. Well, it's now anchored off the Isle of Wight and divers have been sent underneath the ship following concerns about damage to a propeller. The government's confirmed Gibraltar's status as a city more than 180 years after it was first bestowed the title by Queen Victoria. That was in 1842, but it was then left off the official list of recognised cities. Now, a newly published record confirms Gibraltar's inclusion. Prime Minister Boris Johnson describes the decision as a huge accolade to its rich history and dynamism. This is GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to the briefing with Tom.
Thank you, Rosie. Now, coming up this hour on The Briefing, NASA has cancelled its moon rocket launch today because of an engine problem, and engineers failed to fix an engine bleed. I'll be assessing this with the astronomer Mark Thompson. I'll also be showing you my interview with Lord Norton, who is widely regarded as the country's greatest living expert on Parliament, all about its restoration and renewal. Also, we'll be heading to Scotland to get the very latest on those bin strikes with the Scottish Conservative MSP, Jeremy Balfour, as the strikes are now affecting 2/3 of Scotland's local authorities, with people laying the blame on the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, for failing to take proper action. And international inspectors are heading to the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia power plant later on this week, with the mission set to assess physical damage to the plant, determine how well its safety systems are functioning, evaluate working conditions for its staff, and perform any urgent safeguarding activities. I'll be speaking with the defence analyst Stuart Crawford about what we can expect. And France might have hoped that the departure of Boris Johnson could present a chance to reset their relations with the UK, but Liz Truss's comments last week could have damaged this. I'll be speaking with the Paris-based journalist Peter Allen about what the future holds for Anglo-French relations. And of course, through it all, give me your political briefing. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me @GBNews. Now, first today, NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of its engines. The unmanned rocket would be the world's most powerful to date, if it launches, that is. It was due to propel a test capsule, Orion, far from the Earth into the moon's orbit. Engineers say an engine bleed couldn't be remedied, but they've said that the first opportunity for the next launch attempt will be the 2nd of September, depending, of course, on how this engine bleed develops. Well, astronomer Mark Thompson joins me in the studio. And Mark, we were sat there watching what we hoped would be this launch earlier today. Well, it was always an opportunity that a launch can be scrubbed. How regular of an occurrence is this sort of thing?
Do you know, it happens probably more often than people realise, chiefly because of weather conditions, more often than not. It's not often we see engineering issues. Sometimes it does happen, but of course, when you're dealing with a new rocket, it's not like space shuttle days when we'd launched space shuttles a number of times and we knew the technology very well. This is new technology and it's not been launched before. So it does happen, but it's always better to be safe in a situation. You've got almost 1 million tonnes of highly flammable liquid on board. You don't want to be launching it until you're absolutely ready.
I suppose this has been a very delayed project. The Space Launch System has gone through many different iterations under 3 different presidents, and initially was meant to launch almost a decade ago. It's using old technology, a lot of it borrowed from the Space Shuttle programme. Is this potentially not the most snazzy rocket in the world? Is this actually a bit cobbled together from pretty outdated tech?
You know, when you compare it to the Saturn V, so the Saturn V was a rocket that took Armstrong and Aldrin to the moon back in the 60s. The technology now, you know, your phone has got far more power in it than the Saturn V rocket had all those years, almost 50 years ago, or just over 50 years ago. So, yes, you know, it has borrowed some of the technology, but actually sometimes that's the right thing to do. You know, you can't improve on, for example, solid rocket boosters. They were used for the space shuttle very successfully. The only downside with a solid rocket engine is that once you ignite it, you're going into space whether you like it or not. But it combines solid rocket with liquid propulsion, which is much more controllable. So, yeah, it has cobbled together the technology from previous launch systems, but they work, and they've been proven to work many times.
Just looking at it physically, it looks like some sort of combination between that Saturn V and the space shuttle, the two solid rocket boosters on the side, the big tank in the middle. But of course it is expendable. And we're talking now in an era where so many different rocket companies are really pushing the needle when it comes to reusing rocketry. It's what the space shuttle was meant to be, but never quite got to the rapidly reusable phase. Is this space launch system, is this Artemis programme maybe not going to last for that long? Is this the last big expendable project that we might be seeing?
I think, yes, it is. You know, we've seen the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos develop some fascinating technology. We've only got to look at the Starlink rockets that have landed. You know, they've sent up this massive, great rocket, not as big as the Artemis rocket, but they've sent up rockets that have then landed quite safely. And so the technology is there to build reusable rocket technology. We need to advance it a little bit to get to the scale of the Artemis system, but that's not far away. So I think, yeah, this probably is the last of those sort of expendable systems, and before very long we're going to see some very impressive technology that will make it all much more reusable, which will drive down the costs.
Really interesting to see how sort of states and governments use this very expensive, use it once and then throw it away technology. But these entrepreneurs trying to find ways to cut costs, reducing the costs, I suppose if you're a profit-making business, you have to make those savings, and potentially that leads to greater sustainability when it comes to space travel. Yeah,
do you know, it does, and we've seen, you know, since the days of the Apollo mission, we've seen how the real driver behind the Apollo missions was one of the political power, wasn't it? The Americans wanted to beat the Russians to be the first people in orbit, to be the first people on the moon, etc., etc. So it was a political driver, and absolutely, I think commercial organisations are much more about the bottom line. They're much more about cost and doing things as cheaply as possible. And I think that's a good thing. You know, it's driving the cost down of space exploration, and it means in the future it will drive it into a market potentially of tourism, where it will make it something that, you know, even you and I could go off into space for a holiday one day.
It is remarkable looking at what happened in the early 1970s. There was such incredible progress with technological development. You saw all of these magazines and television shows and science fiction thinking everyone would be flying around in their own personal little flying cars or rockets in just a... And it's easy to see why people thought that, because in 1950 you didn't even have really many jet engines, let alone people going into space. And then within 2 decades, you go from basically a pretty sedentary species to one that's standing on another world. It's remarkable how quick that progress was, but also how quickly it sort of fell away, or at least judged to a low Earth orbit halt, potentially because the political will went away, the money wasn't there, it was so incredibly expensive, and the world moved on to other things.
Yeah, and, you know, for governments, it's very difficult, isn't it, to justify that kind of expense. You know, we're looking at sort of $4 billion per launch of the Artemis system. The whole Artemis project is about $93 billion. And when governments have got so many other things to be spending money on here on this, you know, the surface of the Earth, it's difficult to justify that. Of course, commercial operations, they don't need to justify it. They can spend it on what they want to spend it on. And, you know, I think it really is the commercial operations are going to be the people that drive the cost down and give us that world of people dancing around in shiny silver outfits and having our own space systems that we can use as and when we want to.
Well, let's talk specifically about Artemis, because, of course, today was supposed to be the launch of really the first test of this system, Artemis 1. Then we've got Artemis 2, which will be the first time that humans are sent up on top of this enormous rocket and flung round the moon and then splashed down back on Earth again. But then Artemis 3 is where it potentially gets very interesting. The first moon landing in over 50 years, humans on the moon. What sort of timescales are we looking at?
surprisingly not that long, depending on this launch going to plan, of course, you know, and we've already had a delay. In fact, we've talked about the delay with the Artemis project for quite some years now. We're looking at, once this Artemis 1 is launched, we're then looking at just a couple of years before we can get the Artemis 2 spacecraft up with people actually on board and actually orbiting around the moon. I wouldn't want to be those astronauts who've got to go all the way to the moon and then actually not land. That would be terrible, wouldn't it? So we're looking at a couple of years.
Was it Michael Collins who did that on the
Michael
first?
Collins on the... could you feel? I felt for the poor chap. I wasn't even around then, but I felt for him still. So it's a couple of years, probably 2024, with a fair wind, that will get people orbiting around the moon. And then as soon as 2025, where we could be looking to get people to land on the surface of the moon. The Orion module, the human element of the Artemis mission, still being worked upon. And, of course, getting people in space is all about food and water and air to breathe. And all those sort of technologies have got to be worked upon. So that's still in progress. And part of this mission that we're trying to see, the Artemis 1 mission, is about developing that technology and testing that technology for that to happen. So we're looking at maybe, 5 years to get people back on the moon. And then the grander scale goal for the Artemis project is to get a gateway around the moon, an orbiting station around the moon, then a permanent base on the moon of some sort, and ultimately trips to Mars.
I mean, it does sound like the most fantastic sort of science fiction. But when we look at this in the round, I suppose none of it is easy. It's all very difficult, but it's interesting that we have landed, or at least the Chinese have landed, rovers on the moon, remote rovers. The Americans have landed remote rovers on Mars. I suppose the really tricky thing is getting... we can get things to these celestial bodies pretty easily. It's getting them back up and out again.
It's that, but it's also about getting humans there. If you've got to go to the moon, it's 2 or 3 days' journey. So you can manage that. If you want to go to Mars, it's upwards or up to about 6 months to get there. You might have to stay on the surface of Mars for about 6 months and then possibly another 6 months to come home again. Now, psychologically, that is incredibly difficult. You've just got to imagine being cooped up in a fairly small house with 3 or 4 people for 6 months, maybe 18 months. That takes a lot of psychological challenges. So
with the big problems of deep space exploration as well. We've stayed within low Earth orbit for most of the time that we've had people up in space, protected by the Earth's magnetic field. We don't really know the consequences of solar flares, of radioactivity on the human body out there in deep space, away from the protection of the Earth. I suppose that's going to be a big challenge as well.
It is, and one of the wonderful things that NASA are doing, they've got these people, they're not people, they're Munnikins, they've called them, which are just, well, they must have spent a PR company hundreds of thousands of dollars to come up with that, but they're basically mannequins which are dressed in a new type of spacesuit, which they've got sensors all over the bodies to see what kind of radiation they're going to experience, what kind of vibrations and other environmental conditions that those astronauts will experience on that trip to the moon. Because the trip's going to be out near them, on the Artemis project, the Orion module will be at the moon for at least a couple of weeks. So it's going to be interesting to see how that actually does affect a human body.
It's remarkable. We're going to be getting so much real-world data, and I suppose, crucially, different from any other moon mission that we've seen before, HD camera video footage. And this is going to be the most extraordinary thing, even from this launch today, or, well, potentially later this week, if it goes all to plan. This is going to be the first time that we get some of the most high-quality footage of any celestial body, really. I suppose not as good as sending a person there with a camera, but miles and miles away from the early 1970s.
Yeah, absolutely. We have had, as you said, we've had the Chinese have sent craft to the moon, so we have had some incredibly high-resolution images of the moon and of Mars. So, we've got a lot of good data. But what we've not got is human experience. But, picking up on what you said about high resolution, just seeing the pictures from the launch site today, the quality of that was just incredible compared to the Apollo mission, when you had a very grainy sort of image of the Saturn V as it was launching. And that footage is incredible in itself. But to get high definition of the rocket launching, I'm just looking forward to that alone. It's going to be incredible.
Well, it's a lot to look forward to, and we'll be keeping our eyes peeled when it finally does happen. But for now, astronomer Mark Thompson, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing this afternoon. Now, coming up, we're going to cut to my interview with Lord Norton, who's widely regarded to be one of the country's greatest living experts on Parliament, about its restoration and its renewal, and whether or not it's falling to bits. But before that, let's take a look at the weather. Well, looking ahead, and the UK is looking dry for many, although some showers developing across the north and east. Let's take a look at those details. Many northern and eastern parts of Scotland will have a rather cloudy afternoon, where further west we'll see some sunshine. There'll be a few showers developing, especially over the higher ground. Over to Northern Ireland, where we may see the odd shower develop, but most will miss them and have a dry afternoon with some spells of sunshine. Northern England will see a fair amount of cloud this afternoon, but it'll be mostly dry. The best of any sunshine will be along the Irish Sea coasts. Over to Wales, though, which will see brighter skies this afternoon, especially out towards the west. A few showers may develop, but most will be dry, with temperatures reaching the mid-20s in places. The Midlands will see a dry bank holiday afternoon, but there will be a fair bit of cloud around, especially in the east. Despite this, temperatures will reach the low 20s. It may feel a tad cooler than late across East Anglia this afternoon as a keen northeasterly breeze develops. It'll be dry though, although rather cloudy. The east to northeast breeze will also be noticeable along the south coast this afternoon. Many of us, though, will see some sunny spells, especially out towards the west. Cloud will then melt away as we move towards the evening, but some showers will continue in the north. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage. Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GBNews.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events And I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
Welcome back. We're moving on from the content of our political landscape to the landscape of our politics. Those of you who may have visited or passed by the Palace of Westminster will have noticed swathes of the building is sheathed in mesh and scaffolding. But what's the story behind why these extensive works are needed? And what exactly needs to be done? Well, I've been catching up with Lord Norton, who is widely regarded to be one of the country's greatest living experts on Parliament and its restoration. Welcome to the Palace of Westminster, or at least seen from one of the few angles where you can't see that much scaffolding. I'm here today to talk about exactly what's going on with all of the scaffolding we see covering the sides of the Palace of Westminster, blighting, some would say, Parliament. What's going on with all of that construction, maintenance and restoration work? I caught up with the constitutional expert and member of the House of Lords, Lord Norton, to tell us exactly what the restoration and renewal project is all about. Lord Norton, it seems like we've been talking about the grand restoration and renewal project of the British Parliament for years now. And it seems like there have been so many discussions, debates and votes, and yet nothing has really been agreed. It seemed at one stage people wanted to leave Parliament to repair it. Now it looks like an iterative process. The whole place is constantly clad in scaffolding. What on earth is going on? Why haven't any decisions been made?
Well, you're quite right, and it's not that it's not progressed. In fact, it's regressed in terms of the decisions that have been taken. If anything, we're going backwards on earlier decisions. We did pass an Act of Parliament trying to address it. Now the intention is to move away from that. And I think it's a clash between recognising the need to do something to deal with the palace it is in a state of decay, against members who are reluctant to move out. Does that tend, oh, well, yes, something must be done, but not now, because it's extraordinarily expensive to keep the palace as it is maintained, never mind the cost of having to restore and renew the place.
So this is the interesting distinction. I know that maintenance as it stands sometimes runs over £100 million a year just to keep things standing still, or according to one recent report, actually to keep things sliding backwards but at a slower pace than they might otherwise be. Why on earth have we got this gridlock over making a decision?
Money, it's thought, well, it'd be politically unacceptable to spend 17-20 billion pound on renewing it, although if they try and stay in, the cost becomes even more exorbitant. Let's
take a step back and just, I think there's a wide understanding that the Palace of Westminster is quite old, is failing in places, not just in those who we elect, but also in the structure of it itself. It's crumbling to bits. Just how bad has it got?
It's got very bad because it was built in the mid-19th century and nothing really substantial done since the Second World War. It's been patching things up as we've gone along, which is now added to the problem because so much has been done on an incremental basis. There are wires all over the place. There are actually flues which are so concentrated with wires in them that you can't get into them because they're just chock-a-block and nobody's sure where all the wires go. The challenge is enormous, and it is in a state of complete disrepair, and there is the prospect of catastrophic failure. The water system might give up, or some other infrastructure, making the place uninhabitable anyway, and we're just having to try and tread water to keep the place going, but in a way that it's actually difficult to keep on top of.
Currently, as I understand it, there are individuals who are hired to walk around the building 24/7, just looking out for fire. Yes. How have we got to that stage?
The estate is a great fire. It's the palace. As you say, we've got fire watchers. They're there 24 hours a day going round, making sure that the places that there isn't a fire, which are absolutely catastrophic. So the sort of maintenance minor costs each year, it's about £15 million cost of public purse. But then there are other major projects as well, which this year, next year, the year after, run at roughly about 100 million. So over the next 4 or 5 years, the cost of the public purse of just keeping it going is going to be about £400 or £500 million.
There are a number of parliaments around the world that have suffered this same dilemma, most notably and probably most comparably Canada, where they have decided to decant. For 10 years, multiple parliamentary terms, they are sitting in a pretend House of Commons, one that's built in a separate building temporarily, and they conduct their business in that. Is that what we're facing? Potentially over a decade of MPs not being in the same chamber that Winston Churchill stood in, that Clement Attlee stood in, that Margaret Thatcher stood in, potentially losing that sense of history for over a decade?
Well, that would be the best case scenario, just 10 years or more moving out, because if we try and stay in and work round it, it wouldn't have the same characteristics, the same features we associate with Parliament. I say that could take up to 70 years or more.
70 years?
Well, 76, I think, was the latest estimate, at enormous public expense. So the least costly option, and the one that would take least time, is that of both houses decanting for 10, 15 years, possibly a bit longer, so that it can be undertaken.
And I suppose the terrible irony here is that this is a palace that was constructed in response to a big catastrophic event. The old Palace of Westminster, the Church of St Stephen's and the rest of it burning down in 1834 as a response to a tally stick fire beneath the House of Lords.
That's the real danger, that there's a repeat, because there's a major fire risk, it could burn down. And the difference is that this time we're dealing with a site that's a World Heritage Site, Grade 1 listed. It's so iconic that we want to preserve it. So to lose it would be a complete, not just national disaster, but obviously international, global, in terms of its impact. So we need to preserve it. But the longer we prevaricate and can't make up our mind as to what to do about it, of course, the greater the danger of that happening. So the danger is the decision will be taken out of our hands because there will be some catastrophic failure.
So why is there all this netting around Victoria Tower?
That one is simply to catch any masonry that may fall. So it's actually a protective device, nothing to do with actually making any significant changes. It's purely because there have been problems with falling masonry throughout the palace. And I gather the Victoria Tower is a problem, and there is the prospect of some parts of it falling.
Until there is an enormous restoration project on the tower itself, a sort of cocoon perhaps, like there was with Elizabeth Tower at the other end.
Yes.
This will just stay there in perpetuity until something gets done.
Well, unless they're practicing to do anything else with it, but again, it would be temporary rather than part of the R&R programme. So there's lots of temporary measures just to protect places. Others, there will be some work done to patch it up, but essentially that's what it is around the palace. It's just patching up until such time as we actually get round to undertaking R&R.
So I suppose until restoration and renewal starts properly, Parliament will continue to have big, ugly sheets of scaffolding engulfing it, waxing and waning at points, but sort of always there.
Absolutely. It will be a continuous process. Some part of the palace will just be engulfed in scaffolding of this sort, which is both extensive, aesthetically unappealing, and sends out a rather bad signal about Parliament, how people view the actual institution of Parliament. It's not drawing them in of wanting to come and see how Parliament operates.
Now, I suppose some people would say that the restoration and renewal project in and of itself will make Parliament look ugly for an expansive time.
There will be that, and the appeal will simply have to come and look at the two chambers operating separately from the palace, but it's the price one has to pay because one has to tackle the problem, and the problem is an unwillingness to bite the bullet.
Elizabeth Tower, as it was renamed in 2012, has recently become uncocooned. It was stuck in scaffolding for the best part of half a decade, and it looks magnificent now. It has been restored, but this is separate from restoration and renewal.
I mean, they've done a grand job, and this now looks as people expect it to look, so it's a great draw. But actually within the palace, you've still got all the problems, which is why we need restoration and renewal. So internally, it's in a state of great decay and potential problems which could be absolutely horrendous unless they're addressed fairly quickly. So this facade is completely misleading in terms of the challenge faced by the building as a working environment, and one that's actually safe. In the early 70s, if you looked at the palace, it's in a dreadful state because of the effect of all the pollution. The exterior looked basically black, so they had to sandblast it.
This can be very misleading because the way that this has been done, the restoration of Elizabeth Tower, it now looks absolutely magnificent, but this is distinct, this is separate from restoration and renewal.
Yes, I mean, this is just part of maintaining it. What had to be done in any event internal to the palace is the fact that the infrastructure is in danger of collapsing, basically.
Lord Norton there with some really harrowing news about the state of our Parliament. Will politicians fix it? Well, they haven't yet. Coming up, we'll be heading to Scotland to get the latest on the bin strikes, which are now affecting 2/3 of Scotland's local authorities. But before that, it's your news update.
It's 3:34. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of its engines. The unmanned rocket is the world's most powerful to date. It had been due today to propel a test capsule called Orion far from Earth into the moon's orbit. Well, engineers say an engine bleed that couldn't be remedied is the cause of the launch being called off. They added the first opportunity for the next launch attempt will be this Friday, but that depends on how the engine bleed develops. The Artemis 1 mission is aiming to prove people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson emphasised the need for safety checks.
It's just illustrative that this is a very complicated machine, a very complicated system, and all those things have to work. And you don't want to light the candle until it's ready to go.
Residents living near Europe's biggest nuclear facility in Ukraine are being given iodine tablets amid fears of a nuclear incident. Authorities handed out the medication to parents and children who are living close to the Zaporizhia power station amid intense fighting there. A team from the International Atomic Energy Agency is on its way to investigate the now Russian-occupied facility, saying its safety and security must be protected. The Prince of Wales will make a donation to aid charity Islamic Relief to help those affected by the floods in Pakistan. It follows a message from the Queen to the country's president saying she's deeply saddened by the tragic loss of life and destruction due to flooding across the country. There's been an appeal from Pakistan for international support, as more than 1,000 people have been killed. Unusually heavy monsoon rains have caused floods in both the north and the south of the country, destroying farmland, crops and impacting more than 30 million people. The government has confirmed Gibraltar's status as a city more than 180 years after it was first bestowed the title by Queen Victoria. Well, that was in 1842, but it was then left off the official list of recognised cities. Now, a newly published record confirms Gibraltar's inclusion. Prime Minister Boris Johnson describes the decision as a huge accolade to its rich history and dynamism. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Shortly, we'll be back to the briefing with Tom.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.173 and €1.171. The price of gold currently stands at £1,486.46 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's coming up to 20 minutes to the hour. It's hoped that a new pay offer could be made by unions in a bid to end the bin workers' strike in Scotland. Bin strikes now affect 2/3 of Scotland's local authorities, and rubbish is building up in many town and city centres. GB News Scotland reporter Davy Donaldson has the latest.
Yeah, a real problem here in Edinburgh, as you can see by the amount of rubbish that's strewn across the city. I mean, just have to look here down at my feet. It's supposed to be in the bin, it's not. We've even got a sign here as well which says, "Stop birds spreading litter, close the bin lid." Well, I think it's a little bit late for that given what we're seeing here. And this is just replicated right across the city. Really just people discarding the rubbish everywhere. They've been asked to take it home, take it away with them. Well, that simply really isn't possible. And just to come this way for a second, it's not just here that people are managing to dump rubbish. Over this fence, you see down below there, people have just slung their rubbish just over this fence here. So really, this situation is getting out of control. This is the 12th day of the strikes in Edinburgh. Obviously, this rubbish needs to be cleaned up. There is some good news though. COSLA, the body who represent local authority, have met with unions. There is going to be an offer on the table, we're told. We're not sure the details of that yet. I would imagine it would have to be more than the 5% that was previously put out, or certainly some of the conditions would have to be different for the unions even to be able to sit down and discuss that. But they'll obviously have to put that to their members as well. So it could be some time before we see an end to strikes. The hardest thing as well with this is that the strikes are continuing across Scotland. We've got areas like Stirling, West Lothian, Aberdeenshire and Glasgow that are still under strike action. So obviously the rubbish is piling up there, and hopefully we can see an end to scenes like these.
Well, thank you to Davy Donaldson there, who was standing by rubbish that wasn't in the bin. Well, let's speak now to Jeremy Belfer, Scottish Conservative MSP. And Jeremy, what is it that is so particularly that has gone so badly wrong in so many parts of Scotland? We're not seeing this sort of issue, not in Wales, not in Northern Ireland, and not in England.
Well, I think firstly, the government in Westminster has offered a reasonable settlement to the refuse collectors in England, and I think we've been recognised for what we've done. We've been paid appropriately. That simply hasn't happened here in Scotland. The SNP government have not provided the money that is required by local authorities, and I'm afraid the blame lies at the door of the Scottish Government, who have to fund local government. They have failed to do that over a number of years, and it's now becoming very clear that this is a direct result of that lack of funding.
It's a problem that is appearing north of the border. Whenever there's a genuine concern of people in Scotland, the SNP seem to say that it's not their fault at all, that only with more control being given to Holyrood, with more control being given to Nicola Sturgeon, it would all be fine. And clearly, it's all the fault of Westminster. Does that argument carry much weight with you?
Well, it's an easy narrative, but it's actually a completely false narrative. What we need to see is the Scottish Government actually using the power that they have already here in Scotland to help the people of Scotland. We're not seeing this only in regard to refuse collections. We've seen social security powers being handed back to Westminster because the Scottish Government haven't been able to deal with them in an appropriate way. We have a Scottish Government who likes to blame everybody but the people that should be blamed, which is themselves.
It is the most remarkable situation. It reminds me of these scenes that we've seen so much going back through archives of historical footage back in the winter of discontent, Trafalgar Square piled high with rubbish. That had some pretty profound political consequences. Of course, there was a general election the year after that winter, or just following that winter, and of course the incumbent government got turfed out and a new one got put in. What are the chances of scandals like this, scandals like the rubbish being left out on the streets, like the ferry fiasco that we saw, like the real issues with educational standards in Scotland as well? Why don't they seem to be having electoral consequences?
Well, I think it will start. I think the narrative is building up there. I think we've seen a number of issues which the Scottish Government have completely failed on. As you've mentioned, the ferries, we've seen the gap for those in education, the exam results going in the wrong direction, and now we've seen simply the lack of action in regard to that. And I think people in Scotland are waking up to see that this is not a Westminster issue, that it's all to do with Scottish Government. All the powers the Scottish Government have, they are simply failing to provide the services that people want for themselves and for their families, whether it's education, local authority, health, transport. We fail. And I think they will start to pay that price. I think people are now waking up to realise that actually Nicola Sturgeon has failed the people of Scotland over and over again.
It's a really fascinating story. Jeremy Balfour, thank you for that analysis there. Conservative Scottish MSP, of course. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing. Well, international inspectors are heading to the Ukrainian nuclear plant at the centre of a growing alarm around potential radiation spilling out. The United Nations nuclear watchdog mission is set to arrive at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia power plant later on this week, offering hope for progress, even as the two warring sides exchanged new accusations of shelling around the complex in southern Ukraine. The mission will assess physical damage to the plant, determine how well its safety systems are functioning, evaluate working conditions for its staff, and perform any urgent safeguarding activities. Well, let's speak to the defence analyst Stuart Crawford about this concerning situation, because of course we have heard of nuclear issues very famously in Ukraine before. Just along the banks of the Dnieper River is of course where potentially the most famous nuclear disaster in world history took place, of course, at Chernobyl. We're not looking at anything of this scale yet, but clearly big concerns. In your view, Stuart Crawford, did the Russians deliberately target this plant in order to make those concerns more real?
Good afternoon, Tom. That's a difficult question to answer. I'm not exactly an expert on nuclear energy, but I do understand that the plant at Zaporizhzhia is considerably more modern than Chernobyl, and therefore the likelihood of a repetition of the Chernobyl disaster is not very high. You'll be aware, I think, or most of you will be aware, that there are 6 reactors at Zaporizhzhia, 4 of which have been shut down for some time. and the remaining operating 2 are encased in what is virtually bomb-proof and attack-proof concrete casements. So in terms of direct impact, I think there is very little chance of them being breached. Having said that, accusations flying to and forth about shelling by either side and military equipment being held within the plant area is disquieting. So I think we are right to be concerned. I don't think the Russians necessarily have thought this through and made this an issue, but I think it's an issue which has evolved as the war continues.
What does it say about the tactics of the Russian army here? Perhaps even the desperation of them. It's not clear that this is a military target. This is a piece of civilian infrastructure. Is it legitimate for the Russians to have gone after this target, for there to have been such intense fighting around this key area? Is this normal in a theatre of war?
Well, certainly interdiction of communications, etc., civilian communications, is part and parcel of the whole disruptive practice of war making, if you like. Hence, we see the dropping of bridges, the bombing of roads, etc., etc. I think where we've got to be careful is when the civilian population, which is not directly involved in any of the conflict, becomes affected. I understand that what the Russians would really like to do is divert all the electricity being produced at Zaporizhzhia to Russia and cut off Ukraine, therefore disrupting Ukrainian power supplies. Now, it's very difficult to draw a demarcation line between doing that against your military opponent and doing that against the civilian population. And that's where the difficulty lies.
Really interesting stuff there. I suppose there's also some movement further south. If we go over to the Kherson region by the Dnieper River, there seems to have, in the last couple of hours, been some really quite significant Ukrainian action. Potentially the Ukrainians being able to push the Russians off that little outpost and back east across the Dnieper River. What information have you been able to gather so far about the very early stages of this operation?
Well, it's a developing situation. The social media is a buzz with it all at the moment, and people are trying to decide and decipher whether this is actually the beginnings of the long-awaited Ukrainian strategic counteroffensive, because there's no doubt there's increased activity around Kherson, including the use of long-range missiles on various Russian sites and on the communications, the bridges across the Dnieper River. I think that the Russian army finds itself in a precarious position because there is a great danger that it will be cut off from the rest of the Russian army in Kherson because it's on the west side of the Dnieper. But I'm not convinced that the Ukrainian armed forces are sufficiently strong or trained yet to carry out a major counteroffensive. So this may be a local tactical counteroffensive, but one thing is sure, it's certainly causing the Russians a certain amount of disquiet.
Certainly. It does seem that there has been a great deal of stalemate across the whole wide front of this war for the last couple of months, really. But this little outpost of Russia just over the river in Kherson, if that can be pushed back, potentially it doesn't move the entirety of the front of the war, but it's a very big symbolic move were the Ukrainians to take back that key port city.
Oh yes, indeed. I mean, it would be a major psychological impact on both sides. The Russians obviously would see it as being a bit of a disaster and a blow to their prestige, and the Ukrainians would be able to say that it is a major victory. So it is important, as you said quite rightly, it doesn't really change the front lines very much, but it's just part and parcel of the ongoing balance that the whole war has slowed down into at the moment. We are in an impasse. How long that will last remains to be seen, but winter is fast approaching.
Well, winter has always been whenever there's a problem with fighting Russians, that always does seem to be the moment it all becomes unstuck. Once in the last 2 centuries. Could that be the case in this century? Well, I suppose it remains to be seen. But for now, Stuart Crawford, really appreciate your analysis on the developing situation.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. Now, France had hoped for a reset in Anglo-French relations once Boris Johnson departed as Prime Minister. However, now the largely expected victory of Liz Truss as his successor in number 10 Downing Street next week could send tensions potentially into overdrive. The Tory leadership candidate last week set the tone during a hustings, vowing to judge the French President Emmanuel Macron by his deeds, not his words, and warning that the jury is out on whether or not he's Britain's friend or foe. Well, let's speak now to Paris-based journalist Peter Allen. And Peter, has this penetrated French media? Is the French discourse aware of what Liz Truss said at that hustings last week?
It absolutely is, Tom, and it's been quite antipathetic towards the British, I must say. They are surprised because these comments didn't come out in the context of a particular dispute. For example, I know Liz Truss was very much involved in the fishing rights dispute in the English Channel, for example, and a few angry words were expressed on both sides then. And that was felt to have been about right. But in this particular context, it was perceived as an attack on Emmanuel Macron per se, simply because there was some doubt whether he is an actual friend of Britain. And of course, remember, it's taken very seriously here. If you're the chef d'etat, if you're the president of the Fifth Republic, you represent the Fifth Republic. There's no king or queen here anymore. The president is the top man. It's always been a man. There's never been a woman, so that's not a sexist point. But that's how it was perceived, Tom. It was seen as an attack on France in general, particularly at a time of heightened tension over Ukraine and Ukraine's war with Russia. And of course, Britain and France are both great allies within NATO. And this idea that the two might not be very, very obvious friends was something, this idea was something that shocked a lot of people here in France, Tom.
Is it possible that France and the United Kingdom can get back to... I'm not sure if actually the French and the English or the French and the British have ever had a particularly warm relationship outside of a time of world war. I think I'm right in saying that over the last 500 years or so, there's probably been more time that Britain's been at war with France than at peace. But are we really entering this world where almost there's political dividends for the British Prime Minister who riles up the French, and frankly, potentially political dividends for a French president who takes a pop at the British?
Of course, there's been an entente cordiale for well over 100 years now, and the days of Britain getting involved in wars with the French are long gone. That has to be said straight away. They're very much firm allies, not least of all militarily. But of course, the best of enemies, as they say. The two countries, they're very short distance apart, but culturally they couldn't be more different. And if you think that France's modern identity is very much as one of the founding fathers of the European project, and Britain has just left that project, that is an obvious cause for ongoing antagonism between the two countries. And I think that's really what underpins all this. I know we haven't got time to go into all the issues that might divide France and Britain, but that's the main one, Tom. And I think that will certainly be ongoing.
Yeah, potentially not to be fixed anytime soon. But for now, Peter Allen, thank you so much for your analysis here. End of the interview and indeed end of the programme. You've been watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. The show's back every weekday from 9:30 in the morning. Coming up next, it's Brazier, but for now, here's the weather, read by me. So looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking dry for many, although some showers developing across the north and east. Let's look at these details. Many northern and eastern parts of Scotland will have a rather cloudy afternoon, where further west will see some sunshine. There'll be a few showers developing, especially over the high ground. Northern Ireland may also see the odd shower develop, but most will miss them and have a dry afternoon with some spells of sunshine. Northern England will see a fair amount of cloud this afternoon, but it'll be mostly dry. The best of any sunshine will be along the Irish Sea coasts. Wales will, though, tend to see brighter skies this afternoon, especially out towards the west. A few showers may develop, but most will be dry, with temperatures reaching the mid-20s in places. Over to the Midlands, where they'll see a dry bank holiday afternoon, but there will still be a fair bit of cloud around, especially in the east. Despite this, temperatures reaching the low 20s. Maybe a bit cooler than late across the East Anglia this afternoon as keen northeasterly breezes develop. It'll be dry though, and rather cloudy. The east to northeast breeze will be noticeable along the south coast this afternoon. Many of us will see some sunny spells, especially out towards the west. Cloud will then melt away as we move towards the evening, but some showers will continue in the north. And that's how the weather's shaping up for the rest of the day.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge and also